Well, thank you very much, Jed. If I could acknowledge, first of all, the Gadigal people and their elders, both past and present, as of course we have this Congress on Indigenous land. I'd particularly like, on behalf of the panel, to thank the ACTU for inviting us to do this absolutely fascinating work. I think it was no trial, I have to say. Each of us, I think, found it enormously revealing and challenging, and it was a great privilege to be asked to do this work on behalf of the Labor movement. I acknowledge, of course, the distinguished leaders of the movement, Joe de Bruin, the ACTU Vice President, Jed Carney, the President of the ACTU, Jeff Lawrence, Secretary of the ACTU, the Secretary-elect, Dave Oliver, and, of course, the members of our panel who've just been introduced, Paul Munro, Sarah Charlesworth and Jill Peddington. It's an enormous pleasure to present to you the report of the independent inquiry into insecure work. I think we need to understand there's been kind of a revolution, enormous change in not only the Australian workplace but in Australian society over the past 30 years. And I don't want to underestimate the changes that have occurred. The internationalisation of the Australian economy over the past 30 years has undoubtedly improved living standards. At the same time, however, changes occurred in our economy and in our society that have given rise to the unprecedented growth of insecure work. If you think of a single word to sum up the post-war period, it was the word security. What full employment was all about when it was a white paper was introduced by Nugget Coombs in 1945, it was about giving the workforce security in terms of full employment. Now, there are problems with that. But if security was the word then, I think what we've seen over the last 30 years is a much greater sense of risk and uncertainty. Now, the panel, of course, gave a lot of thought to the drivers. In fact, I think we could have conducted our whole inquiry about the drivers, because the drivers are a massively important issue. We've seen, of course, the great internationalisation of the Australian economy. I gather Laurie Carmichael is here and he remembers the enormous technological revolution that was taking place in the 80s and 90s and has continued on over a longer period of time. Been huge changes in the Asia-Pacific region. The whole nature of international competition has changed. The nature of employment has changed in what is now a knowledge or information economy. Now, that's not all of the drivers, but those are part of this enormous change that we've seen. Of course, the key driver has been the emergence of a business model across the entire economy that shifts the risks associated with work from the employer to the employee and minimises labour costs at the expense of job quality. In some ways, the spread of insecure work, of course, has taken place under the radar of the political class. That's not to say that not work has been done. I think of the work that John Buchanan has done at the University of Sydney over a very long period of time, Ian Campbell at RMIT University, Barbara Cocock in South Australia. Enormous work has gone on, but in a sense that work hasn't been heard. And the importance of our inquiry, in a sense, is we lifted that work up and we enabled a process to take place where people could respond, where we could listen, and we could begin to understand the dimensions of what that change has been. There's been no thorough public inquiry, of course, into the effects of a trend which affects up to 40% of the workforce in some kind of casual contract, labour hire or other insecure arrangement, and sees 25% of workers with no sick leave or paid leave. An enormous change. This was an issue crying out for a deep and far-reaching investigation. And I hope that if we've done nothing else, we've put this issue on the national agenda. And in many ways, that's going to be up to the ACTU. As historically the Labor movement has been led by the ACTU to put issues on the agenda and say those issues are so important that they need to be addressed. To organise and to learn and research and put the issue actually on the agenda. Investigation is not enough. Investigation is not enough. The growing crisis of insecure work cries out for action that will translate our findings into real change for the people most affected. The stories we've heard throughout our inquiry were compelling and at times confronting. Over 25 days of hearing in 22 towns and cities, we visited every state and territory. We heard from workers in every sector of the economy, whether in capital cities or in regional areas, men and women, blue collar and white collar, working in the public sector or the private sector, in secondary or tertiary or service industries. Across the board, we heard the same story, the story of a new divide in the Australian economy. It's not between the blue-collar and white-collar worker, but between those in the core of the workforce and those increasingly on the periphery. Those in the core are likely to be in full-time employment, either permanently within organisations, in management positions, or possessing skills for which there is steady demand and for which they can charge a premium. They are likely to have sick leave, paid holidays, and in many cases parental leave above the government's minimum standard. For them, flexibility means the chance to work in a variety of industries, to work overseas, to earn good money, freelancing or in secure part-time arrangements. Periods of unemployment are likely to be short or voluntary. Below and around this group are those on the periphery. They are employed on various insecure arrangements, casual, contract or through labour hire companies, often on low wages and with no benefits. Many do not know what hours they will work from week to week and often juggle multiple jobs in an attempt to earn what they need to put food on the table. Their skills are often low or outdated and they're not offered training through work. They shift between periods of unemployment and underemployment that destroy their ability to save. Their work is not a career. It's a series of unrelated, temporary positions they need to pay rent, bills and for food. For them, flexibility is not knowing when and where they will work, facing the risk of being laid off with no warning and being required to fit family responsibilities around unpredictable periods of work. Perhaps the most serious problem we heard again and again was the sense that people in this situation had no identity. Very often when you talk to someone you meet someone, you say, well, where do you work? Where do you work? In a sense, work is very much part of your identity. But for people who work casually, very often they can be working alongside someone who's a permanent worker, who's very much part of the firm. Everyone knows Harry. But for that insecure, part-time or casual worker, very often there's no sense that they're really part of the firm in a serious way. For many, life on the periphery is not a temporary situation. There's no pathway to the core. Contrary to the views of some in the business lobby that workers are attracted to casual or temporary work because of the flexibility it offers, the evidence we heard confirms the view that there are a very large number of people engaged in insecure work who want more secure and stable working arrangements but find themselves trapped on the periphery of the workforce. We saw evidence of this right across the economy. In every city and town we visited, we met school teachers, TAFE teachers, university staff employed on a casual basis or on rolling fixed-term contracts. What was once seen as a lifelong vacation at the end of years of tertiary study is now very often treated by governments as a temporary job. We met countless casual workers in low-paying industries like security, contract cleaning, call centres, childcare, workers who face unstable and variable working hours, pay often so low that many of them have to hold down 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. little or no access to paid leave, and little or no say in their work. In Sydney, we heard from women being paid piece rates in the textile industry that amounted to $4 or $5 per hour to produce garments with a retail value of $1,000. The multi-layered supply chain they work in means there might be 5 or 6 contracting levels between the worker and the retailer, leaving these women with no bargaining power and no ability to push back against intimidation, harassment and bullying. Insecure work, of course, is rife in the not-for-profit sector, particularly among frontline workers delivering critical community services. As we devolve more and more services to the not-for-profit sector, often it means that the jobs, the employment that's provided for those people is much less secure than it would be if the job was being carried out by government employment. The Commonwealth and state public services are increasingly engaging fixed-term contractors and labour hire agencies to deliver core activities at the expense of ongoing employees. The New South Wales state government alone spends $500 million annually employing nearly 12,000 temporary employees through labour hire agencies. We heard many accounts of contractors working in the telecommunications industry, who, though independent by law, are in reality dependent on a single client and some cases explicitly required under their contracts not to accept any other work. Workplaces have emerged in manufacturing, warehousing and logistics, where the vast majority of workers are employed through labour hire agencies, an environment where employees are afraid to raise issues about their pay, conditions or occupational health and safety for fear of not being given any more shifts. In one case in Western Sydney, we encountered a manufacturing plant where the entire staff were employed as casuals through a labour hire firm. Employers were expected to be available for a full working week, were notified by text message around 4 p.m. each day on whether and when they would be required to turn up next day, but without any information about how long their shift would be. Again and again, there are illustrations of the insensitivity of employers to the importance of certainty in rostering hours for families, especially when people had caring responsibilities, whether it's caring for children, for elderly parents, for a disabled dependent or whatever. In a sense, time these days is incredibly important to people who are so often trying to match paid work with their unpaid responsibilities. One cannot underestimate, one cannot overstate the importance of recognising the links between work and family and households are crucial in terms of life today, and yet are so often neglected, particularly in the area of casual work. Put simply, these workers require greater protection in our industrial relations system. But tackling the problem of insecure work cannot be quite reduced simply to a question of regulation. The technological information revolution has transformed the nature and organisation of work, requiring an ongoing commitment to improving the education and the skills of our workforce, not simply in terms of the beginning of the working life, but through life. We need to recognise in an age of very fast and rapid change in technology, in a sense, people do need through-life education. An open economy in an internationally competitive environment like Australia will never be able to compete by driving down labour costs. Instead, we need to focus on productivity, innovation and improving the skills of our workforce. To do that, we need to be radical in our thinking about new approaches to training and education. Without very serious investment in marginal workers, nothing much is going to change. There is a message here for business which ignores the rise of insecure work at its peril. A business model that is predicated on short-term profits generated by widespread use of insecure work is unsustainable in the long run. This has been highlighted during the shallow national debate around productivity, in which business groups have attempted to convince us that the only way to increase productivity is to cut wages and conditions. This ignores the fact that the main long-term drivers of productivity are investment in industry, infrastructure and the skills of workers. Michael Keating, former head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, has noted, the critical problem facing Australia is that there is a structural mismatch between the labour supply and the demand for labour. There is a shortage of skilled labour and a substantial excess of supply of people with low education and skill levels. The nature of training required is also required. In the past, most training for people without post-school qualifications was provided by their employers at the employer's cost. But this approach biases training in favour of very specific job competencies. In a world of changing technology, people need more generic skills that enable them to change jobs and to engage in continuous learning. We need to be building people's capabilities. We need to be building people's capacity to solve problems, to do a range of different jobs. And if we don't invest in that way, then we're going to pay a very high price. Now, in our report, of course, we've made a number of recommendations setting out how we believe a response might be formulated. I have to say that, of course, our report's been done very quickly, and in a sense it's the beginning of a process. Not just a matter of getting down and organising, it's also a matter of understanding more and more of the ramifications of what is a massive and widespread problem affecting the whole nature of the economy. Firstly, we believe that labour law must be reformed to provide a universal set of protection for all Australian workers. We know that there's now this enormous fragmentation. We used to talk about standard and non-standard work. Well, it's not just non-standard work. There are a whole range of different arrangements that have been put into place that affect the conditions and set the terms of work that people do. And of course, as you multiply the number of contracts, in a sense you leave behind the fundamental issue of fairness, which has always driven the labour movement in this country. Fairness has always been absolutely central, and yet in a sense fairness goes as you get this proliferation. So our report outlines some principles of how we can move back to fairness as a fundamental principle. Australia, we argue, must pursue universality in labour law. Doing this effectively requires expanded definitions of employers and employees, reforms to better capture indirect employment arrangements like labour hire and dependent contracting, a firmer definition of casual work, and expanded national employment standards that create a set of inclusive minimum standards that protect all employees. Fairness needs to be across the board, not selective. When you think of the number of people that we met who are being employed casually, not just for 6 months or 12 months, but for a number of years, you think, well, why should that be? Why should that be? When effectively, for all intents and purposes, that's a permanent employee, but is being given the 25% loading, perhaps in compensation, as opposed to being given the rights and entitlements of permanent employment. We've also provided recommendations how an industrial relations system can be reformed to provide stronger legal pathways from insecure work to ongoing employment. However, as I've said, simply refining labour market regulations won't limit the growth of insecure work. To provide decent work for all, we also need to ensure that effective safety nets in place for people who fall out of work, as well as investing more in our workforce, especially the most disadvantaged. We've called for a number of reforms aimed at achieving a more skilled workforce, including a broader focus on work-life transitions rather than a narrow preoccupation with the transition between employment and unemployment that has given rise to an emphasis on welfare to work. In a sense, life these days involves multiple changes, multiple transitions. She is working, then she's having a family, then she's coming back to work. Someone's off doing some training, then they come back to work. There's multiple transitions. People are taking longer to transition into the workforce from school and education. People, in a sense, now have a much longer retirement trajectory. These transitions through life need to be taken seriously as a policy question and addressed in a much more integrated and holistic way. We need... There's a lot of rhetoric about lifelong learning, but the reality is lifelong learning, for all intents and purposes in this country, does not exist. And we need to look at ways of putting that into place in terms of looking at the compensation that people need if they're going to be offline doing a course of study or a piece of work that's going to help them to maintain their skills. We need to recognise that, and we need to pay for that through learning accounts or through some proper mechanism. We need, I think, particularly to reform our tax and transfer systems to provide a stronger safety net, particularly addressing the inadequacy of New Start allowance. Now, as a former Minister for Social Security, I know something about the history here, and I think the history now is something of a disgrace nationally. We have the lowest replacement income for an unemployed person of any country in the OECD. And the derisory way this was addressed in the last budget was regrettable. I mean, frankly, we need to have either a much higher payment of New Start allowance or we need to move to a new system. The current system simply is not working. So, of course, all this emphasis really on punishing the unemployed is really proved counterproductive for a very long period of time. And I think the ACTU has to say that much more clearly to government, that we're not going to wear this situation where unemployed people are treated as a kind of pariah, deprived, for example, of their assets before they'll be entitled to any payment. I mean, that is absolutely absurd, and no sophisticated country should do that. And of course, we need to look at the way that Job Services Australia interacts with forms of insecure work such as labour hires. Labour hires are a very rapidly growing form of employment, and of course it leads to enormous injustices on all sorts of sites, not just construction sites, but many sites now where labour hire is coming in a way that degrades everyone's conditions. It's very unfortunate. We have also called for the ACTU to investigate models for a comprehensive system of employment insurance. I think that's there because, in a sense, we put a lot of emphasis on the safety net, but we've got to anticipate much more risk because, in a sense, the modern economy is a risk economy. We are very much in competition with our whole Asian region and so on, and we need to recognise that that competition is going to introduce risks that are going to be very important across the life course, and we need to anticipate much more risk, not see social responsibility as about providing a safety net when someone falls over, but put much more emphasis on ensuring, as we do with occupation and health and safety, that someone does not fall over. Finally, government also needs to take its role more seriously and recognise just how influential it is as one of the largest employers in the country. Governments at all levels need to make stronger use of their leverage as employers, funders and purchasers to support secure levels of employment. The crisis of insecure work cries out for action that will translate our findings into real change for the people who need it. In many ways, our inquiry is only the beginning of a process. We need to understand all sorts of issues that we simply didn't have the time or resources to look at. For example, Indigenous employment. Huge issue across Australia that we need to be dealing with much more seriously. In terms of migration, the whole pattern of migration has changed. We're moving, I think, towards a kind of guest worker concept, something that Australian migration was never about that. It was always about permanent settlement. It's not just 457s, it's broader than that. So there are a whole range of issues that we need to be understanding and over time building a campaign around those very issues. It's time, I believe, for the ACTU, for the broader union movement, to a deeper engagement with the community to tackle insecure work. One of the good things about our inquiry is the very large number of submissions we got from academics, but also from many community agencies who recognise the importance of this issue because they very often deal with the consequences. You know, we talk about when Henderson did his poverty inquiry in 1970, to be in employment was to be out of poverty. That's no longer the case. No longer the case. So we need to, we talk about working people. Well, working people can be in all sorts of work, and very often it's not work that really does pay the bills and enable people to take out a mortgage. You know, in the post-war, in the pre-war period and the post-war period, virtually anyone in employment could afford to take out a mortgage and own their own house. Now, home ownership is falling in the 25 to 35 age group, and that reflects insecure work, which particularly impacts on younger people. Finally, this is not a matter of turning the clock back. The clock has moved on. I think Laurie Carmichael understood that in the 1980s. He understood perhaps more than few people in the trade union movement how important technological change was, how important the new changes in capitalism were for the modern economy and for modern society. This is not the same capitalism and it's not the same technology, and people's lives are being shaped by the combination of finance, capital in many ways, and of course the pressures of technology and the communication revolution and so on. So this is a new situation, and there's no point in going back. But we ought to be able to bring to this new situation the values that have sustained the trade union movement over a century. During every depression, where has Australia looked? It's looked at the trade union movement. 1890s, 1930s, in the post-war period, and again in the 1980s. And so there's time now for listening. There's time now for doing some serious work on issues, and there's time now for leadership. Leadership in your workplace, leadership across the country, so that we can build a response to this modern economy that embraces justice and fairness as a way of Australian life. Thank you very much.